Next on Book TV, Martin Dugard tells the story of journalist Henry Morton Stanley's African expedition in search of missionary and explorer Dr. David Livingstone. This Public Lives feature is 45 minutes.
All right. Now let me make sure we are on. We are. And y'all can hear all right? Terrific. Well, good evening. And as I said, welcome to Vroman's Bookstore. It has been a very busy and exciting day for us. As I told you earlier, we had a Pulitzer Prize winner here at noon, and today we have with us not only a New York Times best-selling author, but a co-holder of the Around the World Speed Record. So this is a very exciting, interesting day at Vroman's. Martin Dugard is our author this evening. I wanted to share with you a couple of the great reviews that this book has been receiving. The book, as you know, is Into Africa, The Epic Adventures of Stanley and Livingstone. He's received a starred review from Kirkus, and here's just a little excerpt. They call the book an action-packed recounting of one of the most famous incidents in the history of exploration, fine entertainment for adventure buffs, solidly researched, and fluently told. Also getting great reviews from Publishers Weekly, Library Journal, and one of the most critical readers we have here on staff, Sherry Galantine, who came in every day to tell me how far along the journey she had passed and how she couldn't believe that this story she thought she knew was so engrossing. In fact, she lost a night of sleep because of you, and she was pretty mad about it, Martin. In addition to this book, Martin Dugard is the author of Farther Than Any Man and Knockdown, the harrowing true account of the yacht race turned deadly. He's also the co-author of that New York Times bestseller that I mentioned earlier, Survivor, The Ultimate Game. His dispatches have appeared in GQ, Sports Illustrated, and Esquire, and we are delighted to have him here with us this evening. Will you please help me welcome Martin Dugard to Vroman's Bookstore?
Well, thanks very much. It's great to be here. I've never been here before. This is a great store. You know, bookstores are all shapes and sizes, but this is a fantastic store. I'm going to hold this because my voice doesn't carry very well. It's an interesting point that this is one of the stories that everybody thinks that they know, and even as I began writing it, I thought that I knew it. And in fact, it's a largely untold tale. There have been several biographies of Stanley and several biographies of Livingstone, and several recountings of various African explorations during the 19th century. But this is the first time, and I've checked this out thoroughly, this is the first time that anyone has taken just the story of Stanley and Livingstone, that little snapshot in history, and brought the two together. And what I thought was going to be a very simple story, Livingstone gets lost, Stanley finds him, he says, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, end of story, turned out to be this fascinating epic. You've got love, you've got malaria, you've got tribal warfare, you've got all these things, and it doesn't just unfold in Africa. It unfolds in London, and it unfolds in New York. It even unfolds in the American West, and characters like Ulysses S. Grant and Buffalo Cody, Buffalo Bill Cody, even made an appearance. So it was just one of those things that the more I began to dig, the more it really kind of came to life for me. But I'd like to read a little bit for you, just to kind of give you an idea. And this is the part of the story that everybody does know. But just a brief recap. In April 1866, Dr. David Livingstone, who at the time was the world's greatest explorer, went into Africa to find the source of the Nile River. He was an older man. He was definitely on the last journey of his life, but he was the world's greatest explorer. And during the Victorian era, explorers were like rock stars. They were incredibly famous individuals, and Livingstone was the greatest of them all. I mean, he had no parallel. When he walked down the streets of London, he was mobbed. When he went to church, he was mobbed. he was just one of those people that had this kind of this aura about him that even people like the Duke of Wellington, who was a very omnipotent person, respected, and it was attracted to and was drawn to. And even the Arabs whose slave trade Livingstone battled so vehemently were drawn to him as well. They said he had something called baraka, which was this aura of spirituality and greatness about him that drew people to him. But he goes into Africa and he gets lost. He is missing for 5 full years and nobody knows where he is. The greatest explorer in the world is just gone. It's as if he has vanished off the face of the earth. And reports filter back out of Africa that he has been eaten by cannibals, that he has been burned alive, that he has been hacked up by a rogue Zulu band called the Mazatu, and even that he's taken up with an African woman and started a brand new family. All these rumors come out of it, but nobody actually goes in to check. And that is left to a young American reporter named Henry Morton Stanley. And Stanley was actually Welsh, who had taken on an American persona and adopted everything American and convinced even his employer, James Gordon Bennett Jr. of the New York Herald, that he was actually an American. He had fought for the Blue and the Gray during the Civil War, which kind of helped his cause. And he was just this young upstart reporter who was desperate to prove that he could do whatever it took to keep his job. And at the time, the newspaper wars were very huge in New York and in London. So being a top newspaper reporter was just as important in Stanley's profession as being the top explorer was to Livingstone's profession. But let me read a little bit to you, just to kind of give you an idea of it. To set the scene, Stanley is marching into Ujiji, which is the village on the shores of Lake Tanganyika, where he has heard that Livingstone is waiting. And again, no one has seen Livingstone since April 1866. By now it's November 10th, 1871. The view from the summit took Stanley's breath away. For the first time, Lake Tanganyika shone below him. It was like a silver sea bordered by the most amazingly ominous mountains. Stanley couldn't take his eyes off of it, even as the caravan descended the mountain's far side. It had been almost exactly 2 years since Bennett's commission. The pressures and risks of marching across Africa to find Livingstone had been on his mind every day since. Somewhere down there, on the shores of that sparkling lake, lay Ujiji. To finally see the spot where the meeting would take place, and a lovely spot it was, a beautiful reward for all the toils and struggle, was like a dream come true. As the miles passed, the caravan's trail wound through a field of 10-foot-tall matete grass, elephant grass, that obscured their view of the lake but did nothing to slow their pace. In a few minutes, Stanley wrote, we shall have reached the spot where we imagine the objects of our search. Our fate will soon be decided. No one in the town knows we are coming. When the caravan was just a mile outside of town, Stanley ordered the colors raised and the men to begin announcing their arrival. He gave the order for every man to load his guns. Commence firing, he roared, growing more nervous by the minute that he was on the verge of meeting the great Livingstone. What would happen? Would the veteran explorer run in the other direction? Would he be warm? Was there a possibility, as Kirk had predicted, that he knew of their coming and had already left Ujiji? The flags are fluttered, Stanley wrote. The banner of America is in front, waving joyfully. The sound of muskets firing and horns blowing fills the air, punctuating the flag's presence. Never were the stars and stripes so beautiful in my mind. The residents of the town soon came pouring out to greet them. The arrival and departure of caravans was a regular fact of life in Ujiji, but there had been none for months due to the war with Mirambo. Stanley had blazed a new trail for the caravans to travel. He was no longer a journalist, writing about the actions of others. Henry Morton Stanley had become an explorer, with all the incumbent fame and glory that implied. Even as Stanley strode into town, surprise and happiness could be seen on the faces of the Arabs and locals alike. The Arabs pressed against him, shaking his hand and asking where he'd come from. They were much astounded to find it to be a caravan, Stanley wrote, and to be led by a white man. The whole time Stanley anxiously surveyed the faces around him, but there was none. By the time Stanley made it to the heart of town, thousands of people were pressed around the caravan, and though it was a triumphant moment, with all the fanfare Stanley's phenomenal achievement deserved, he grew suddenly impatient. Livingstone was nowhere to be seen. A young black man then appeared at Stanley's side and spoke to him in English. How do you do, sir? Hello, who the deuce are you? I love that line, who the deuce are you, it cracks me up. I am the servant of Dr. Livingstone. It was Chuma, and as soon as he uttered those intriguing lines, he dashed off just as quickly as he had appeared. Joy, Stanley wrote in his journal, heart beat fast. I had to keep control over my emotions lest my face might betray them or detract from the dignity of a white man appearing under such circumstances. But what would I have given for a bit of friendly wilderness wherein I might vent my joy in some mad freaks, such as idiotically biting my hand, twirling a somersault, slashing at trees or something in order to purge these exciting feelings before appearing in the presence of Livingstone. Everything had come together for Stanley, finally. His years of hunger and failure and rejection, his desperate underdog's need to succeed at all cost, his desire for a loving father figure. Stanley had waited a lifetime for a moment of such appreciation and validation. Now that it had come, the world spun off kilter, robbing him of the stern and angry facade that had driven him across Africa. In its place was a humble young man, desperate to do and say the right thing when meeting one of the world's greatest and most famous men. He wanted to appear smart and genteel, devoid of any pandering tone in his voice. Minutes earlier, Livingstone was sitting on the mud veranda of his small house, pondering his woeful future. His seat was a straw mat with a goatskin on top for cushioning. Behind his back, as he leaned against the hut's mud wall, another goatskin was nailed. The skin kept him from getting a chill as he leaned against the cold mud. Suddenly, he witnessed the unusual sight of little Susie racing down the dirt street. When my spirits were at their lowest ebb, the Good Samaritan was close at hand. For one morning, Susie came running at the top of his speed and gasped out, "An Englishman! I see him!" And off he darted to meet him. Livingstone slowly rose. His doorway faced east, the direction from which the caravan was marching. Livingstone could see everything clearly. Above the throngs of people gathered to greet the incoming caravan, he saw the American flag snapping in the breeze. He didn't see a white man, but porters bearing an incredible assortment of goods soon made themselves obvious. They carried bales of cloths, huge kettles, cooking pots, tents. This must be a luxurious traveler, Livingstone thought, and not one at wit's end like me. What Livingstone saw was a tanned, gaunt young man whose hair was turned prematurely white from stress. His uniform was as crisp as could be expected, given the travel. His boots were well worn. His sun-beaten helmet had been cleaned. All in all, the man had such a formal bearing that, despite the stars and stripes, Livingstone assumed he was French. He hoped the traveler spoke English, because Livingstone didn't speak French. He thought that they would be, quote, a pretty pair of white men in Ujiji if neither spoke the other man's language. What Stanley saw was a pale white man wearing a sun-faded blue cap and a red jabot jacket like the Arabs. His clothing showed signs of being patched and repaired. The explorer's hair was white. He had few teeth, and his beard was bushy. He walked with a firm but heavy tread, as if stepping on thorns. Stanley stepped crisply toward the old man, removed his helmet, and extended his hand. Not counting the months between his great commission and the start of his journey, Stanley had come 975 miles in 236 days for the moment. They wordlessly shook hands, each man appraising the other. Livingstone did not know who the young man was or what he might want. The Arabs and citizens of Ujiji crowded around. According to Stanley's journal, it was November 10th, 1871, a day that would change the world. Stanley's heart was beating furiously, and he was striving desperately to say exactly the right thing to such a distinguished gentleman. Livingstone's British background, though, gave Stanley great pause. He wasn't sure whether or not he was welcome, how Livingstone would react, or whether he was about to be embarrassed in front of a large throng. But Stanley had not come across Africa to be denied. With formal intonation, representing America instead of his native Britain, but trying to affect British gravity and trying to quiet that sing-song Welsh flutter that crept in when he got excited, Stanley spoke the most dignified words that came to mind. "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" "Yes," Livingstone answered simply. He was very relieved that the man was not French. "I thank God, Doctor," Stanley said, appalled at how fragile Livingstone looked. "I have been permitted to see you." "I feel thankful," Livingstone said. "I'm here to welcome you." And that's kind of the summation. I like to think of that as the moment in the book that it's like reading a book about a storm. That's the part everybody knows. You know about the storm, and here you know about what's going on. And I haven't given anything away. What comes before and after is just as much a surprise as just that little moment there. And like I said, the more I dug into this, the more I was fascinated by the nuance and the subtleties and just the intricacies of it. And I don't know if any of you were listening to KPCC this morning. I talked a little bit about when I researched this book. I felt it necessary to actually go to Africa to follow in Stanley's footsteps, to see what it was like to just experience some of that same stuff. And I expected it to be vastly different than it had been. And what I found instead is once you left the cities of Dar es Salaam or Tabora or even Ujiji, Africa is largely unchanged. Africa is still this vast, empty wilderness. Just grassland and acacia trees and lions and leopards and hyenas, and it is amazing to me more than ever how Stanley was able to march across Africa as this relative newcomer to Africa, and to do so successfully when Britain's best explorers had either been unwilling or unable to do the same thing. And another incident when I was in Africa kind of brought all that home to me. Two of my friends came along with me. One was a teacher, one was a stockbroker, and we were just. It was the summer. It was August of 2001, and we had hired a driver in Dar es Salaam, and he spoke Swahili, And we were following the path exactly. We got to a certain point, and it was 5 o'clock in the morning. We were about to begin pressing our journey, further inland. We were almost halfway to Tabora. And the driver had received word from some friends that there were bandits on the road ahead. And he suggested that we detour kind of a little bit southwest. It was a better road. We could make good time. We would actually even be able to follow some of Livingstone's path, and then we could backtrack later and do the Stanley thing. So that was great. I said, that's fine. And it was kind of a real surreal morning, because the guest house where we had stayed was just this. It was this small lodge right in the middle of the savannah, and it was just a real low mud house with a thatch roof. And in the restaurant area the night before, I had left the table halfway through dinner to use the men's room, which was down a long hallway from the dining area. And as I was walking down this hallway, I had the strangest feeling that the walls were moving, and I didn't realize it, but it wasn't just a guest house; it was also a herpetology exhibit. So as you walk down the walls, these glass, thousands of snakes, black mambas, puff adders, cobras, everything in Africa is in these cases along the walls. And I'm walking through there, and it's dark, and it's it's Africa, and I'm alone, and I'm thinking this, and and the black mambas they're really these speedy snakes, and one of them was climbing the glass up, and he couldn't find a way out, but I'm thinking, the glass is that thin, all he's got to do is get lucky, and I'm just cooked. And so that's kind of stuff that's on my mind, So we get up the next morning, and we get in our vehicle, and the driver's taking this new course, and it was a beautiful morning. It was still dark, and there was this full moon rising over the mountains as we kind of ascended up into the mountains, and the moon was just this bright husky yellow, and it just followed us everywhere we went, and we could see a river down in the valley below, and it was just really mesmerizing. And then all of a sudden, at one point, there was an overturned truck, just a big cattle truck, and a mile later there were just a whole herd of cattle running down the middle of this dirt road, just charging. And I felt so bad for them, because they were literally charging to their deaths, because the minute they stopped to rest, they're lion food. And I felt so bad for them. I wanted to tell them, go back. But I guess they're dead either way, right? So they were just running. And so it's this surreal thing. We got the moon, we got the cows, and we had the snakes, and we kept going. And then the sun came up, and we got to this little village of Tunduma, which is on the Zambian Tanzanian border. And like anywhere in the world, like in Tijuana, like in anywhere, border towns are kind of a rabid, manic place. Everyone's kind of edgy. They want to get across the border. And they got someplace to be, and they can't get there because someone's stopping them. And in Africa, a lot, especially because you don't have really paved roads in most places, people will congregate in the roads. There aren't too many cars. And when a car comes along, they'll part, and then they'll come back together, and then they just go about their business. Well, as we came through, the crowd parted, and we weren't going very fast. But at the last minute, a pedestrian darted across the road, and our driver couldn't stop soon enough and actually hit the pedestrian. And with the left front bumper, and I was watching it, and this person just literally sailed. And it was just this horrific sight. We stopped the car, and we're opening the door to get out, and none of the crowd cared about the person. No one's going to help the person. All they wanted to do was pull us out of the car and kill us. And all of a sudden, miraculously, they've got clubs, and they're pummeling in the back of the car, and they're trying to rip us out of the car. And so the driver just floors it, and we're slamming the doors, and we're getting out of there. So the question is, what do we do? We're in Tanzania. We don't know the rules. There are some countries in the third world that will just throw you in jail for something like that until a trial can be held, and that could be months or years or whenever. And we're thinking, what are we going to do? So we're driving across Africa, 50 miles an hour on these rutted dirt roads, and dust flying, and literally passing elephants and giraffes. So again, we've got this surreal quality to all that's going on, and we're fearing for our lives. And we decide that in the next town, when we finally get there, we're just going to go to the police and tell them what happened and just take our chances. So 5 hours later, when we finally get to the next town, we don't need to go see them. They're waiting for us. They've got a roadblock out there. They've got automatic weapons. And it's one of those things, too, that when they talk, they don't keep their weapon pointed at the sky. They keep it pointed right at you as they talk, randomly just kind of waving it around. And so they get in the car, and I got a guy here, and my buddy's got a guy on this side of him, and we're in the back seat. And there's a guy crowding into the front seat as well. They take us to the local police station. And the first thing the driver does is tell them in Swahili that he'd actually been asleep in the back. He'd been tired, that I was driving. I was the driver. And that and that I should be thrown in jail. So they do. They put us in jail, and we're trying to explain ourselves. And the interrogator's name is Mohammed, and the first question he asks us is what is your religion? And then he says, what is your tribe? And I'm thinking, there's not a right answer here. I don't know what I'm going to say, how we're going to get out of this. And we just figured we would tell him the truth, and we would just hope things came together. And it was one of those weird insights as a writer that you kind of get what you ask for. Yeah, I had come to Africa to find out about Stanley's journey, but I didn't know what I was going to get was a real slice of the kind of the stuff Stanley went through on a daily basis. This getting up in the morning, thinking it's a beautiful day, looking forward to this great adventure. Then halfway through your day, something happens that just rocks your world, and you're totally cut off from the rest of the world. There was no telephone we could use. There was no telephone Stanley could use. If we had simply disappeared there, no one would have known what had happened to us. We were out there, and I'm not saying that our journey was even remotely like what Stanley went through, but all of a sudden I had a sensation of the kind of fear that he must have had to squelch every single day. You just have to, shove it down and just kind of trust, have some kind of blind faith that everything's going to work itself out. And it doesn't always, but in this case, as with Stanley's journey, as with us, it did work out, and they let us go. And I'll never forget it. The police commissioner of the town was this, it was a matriarchal kind of town. It was this enormous woman, and she was picking her nose with 2 fingers. I've never seen that before, both nostrils. As she gives us our freedom, I'm thinking, this is so weird, just let us go, And so they give us the car back. The driver actually stays behind, and it was kind of a funny coda. Was by the time we got back to Dar es Salaam, somebody had paid somebody. We saw him walking on the street outside our hotel, and he'd been there for 2 days. He beat us back to Dar es Salaam by a long way. But we continued on, and again, what it did was, that part of the journey not only took us into the realm of the unknown, but it broke up the pace of the journey, so we no longer controlled it. We didn't. Our schedule was shot. All of a sudden, we were just kind of at the whim of whatever Africa wanted to do with us. And by the time we finally made it to Ujiji, almost a week later, we had gone through a number of other strange and calamitous little adventures, including at one moment getting on the train, and in the middle of the night it made a stop, and all the prisoners from the place we had just been were thrown on the train. They'd been stripped naked, they had manacles in their hands and their feet, and they were literally thrown aboard like sacks of flour, and they were just in the passenger compartment on the ground, and people were stepping over them to get to the dining car. And I kept thinking, that could have been me. It was just weird. It was just odd. And so when we finally got to Ujiji, at the place where Stanley and Livingstone met, it's not what you think it's going to be. You think it's going to be this marvelous obelisk or something like that. It's a very nondescript monument, almost in someone's backyard, and surrounded by a fence. And I had to bribe the guy to let us in, and I think everybody has to bribe the guy to let it. It's one of those things. But when we finally got there, I kind of felt like I'm sure Stanley felt like, whew, we did it. We achieved this thing, because what had started off as a very simple journey had become this grail, this quest that we had to fulfill. And a number of times we were thinking, we don't really need to see that spot. We can just get on the plane, and there's a plane leaving tomorrow. We can get on that plane, but we kind of have to keep going. And that was a really neat thing. It was kind of another way to illustrate how off the world, the rest of the world, Africa still is. When I was in Ujiji and we decided that we were going to take the train all the way back to civilization, I went to the train station. I tried to pay for it with a credit card. I don't know what I was thinking, but I gave the man a credit card, and he turned it over in his hands. He kept looking at it. He didn't want to appear stupid, but finally he said, "Where's the money?" And I said, "There is no money. It's a magic." I couldn't explain it, but that was kind of the essence of the whole research. And what I did when I began writing the book was I took those experiences. I took the smells of Africa and that kind of that underlying fear that Africa gives you when you're there. And it's one thing to do a kind of one of those game safaris where you're shepherded around. It's another thing to kind of all of a sudden find yourself just cut off out there. And there is just this underlying feeling that you really gotta watch your back. And so I took all that, and plus the beautiful sights of Africa, the acacia trees and just a lion in the wild, just seeing a lion sunning itself, and then but just that kind of that menace about it, and just going by streams and seeing just these pink stepping stones across the surface of the streams, and looking closely and realizing those were all hippos' backs. And it was so cool. You know, you look at that, think, those are hippos, you know, and it's not Disneyland. You know, those are real hippos. And, you know, and then I began writing, and I began making a number of trips to London to the Royal Geographical Society's archives. And that even made it more immediate, because as I read Stanley's original journals and Livingstone's journals and the journals of other people who were prominent in this story, it was so much more immediate, because when you see things in someone's handwriting, I mean their actual own hand, you hold their letter in their hand, and you see a drop of blood that has fallen onto the page as they wrote it, you know, probably under a piece of mosquito netting near a campfire 130 years ago. It just makes these two-dimensional historic figures that everybody thinks they know. You know, Stanley and Livingstone, they're almost cartoons, but all of a sudden they kind of rise up off the page. There are these people that are kind of alive. You know, they take on, you know, their thoughts. You know how they speak. You know the way they write. You know how it is when you read someone's letters. You can kind of tell something about them by their handwriting. You can infer that. And it got to the point that as I wrote the book in my office at home, it was like they were looking over my shoulder. And I know that sounds strange, but they were very, very much alive to me. And now as I kind of close the door on them and get ready to write another book, I almost feel as if I'm betraying them in some way, like, because there are these people who have become such a part of my life. It's almost like there's some kind of relationship. It's a very one-way relationship, but they have told their story to me through Africa, through their words and their letters, and I've kind of put it on the page in a way that I try to write it not as a history book, because I think history books are boring and they put me to sleep, and I love history, but it's just dull like that. But you know, I try to write it like a novel, like a fast-paced narrative. You know, cram all the detail in there, cram all the information, cram every bit of facts in there, and don't embellish anything, but tell the story in a way that makes you want to turn the page, because that's what their adventure was like. It just didn't stop, and hopefully I've accomplished that. And that was my goal of the whole thing, is to tell the story in a way that makes you want to go from start to finish and hopefully not put it down. Anyway, thank you very much for coming out. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes, sir.
Where did you get access to the letters of Stanley and Livingstone?
There's a lot of places. This is a fun book because it's like detective work. The letters are all in various museums and archives around the world. You know, the British Library, British Museum, Royal Geographical Society archives, the Scottish Library, the New York Public Library. Everybody has a little bit of everything. The Royal Geographical Society has the most of the stuff, and as you can imagine, it is. You know, these are the people who sponsor Livingstone's expedition, and you would think that they would have everything digitized and be this high-class thing. You know, basically, you go to their headquarters and you go up to the attic, and they give you this big file box, and you're going and someone just stuffed the stuff in there, and you pull it out, and there is the invitation to Livingstone's funeral, and there's a picture of Stanley that he had just kind of signed and tossed aside. It's all this. It's like going through someone's attic. It's really cool. But another thing too was that was the great age of newspapers. So I was able to go to the British newspaper library, and they've got newspapers from around the world for centuries, and actually look at what the Times of London was saying, what the New York Herald was saying, what the Bombay papers and the Cape Town papers were saying, and the fun thing about that was not just that kind of just the verbatim stuff about Stanley and Livingstone. It also tells you things like what the weather was like. So it's, as a writer, that's a great thing. You can say, on this day it was raining and it was 52 degrees. That's a great thing, because then then you can really set the scene, as opposed to just kind of alluding to, you think London, it was, say it was cloudy and kind of hope it was cloudy. This way you can be very specific. So that was great. Yes, ma'am. Oh, gotta get the microphone.
How long were you gathering your research?
It was an ongoing process. I spent 4 months before I began writing, doing research, reading other people's biographies of those individuals, reading about the era, going to Africa for 3 weeks, and then making a preliminary trip to the Royal Geographical Society and the British Library. And then, as with anything, the more you know, the less you know. And so just when I thought I was done, I'd find some new, I got to go back and I got to do this. And there was this, for instance, I thought the book was done. And there's this one character in the book, Sir Roderick Murchison, who literally is the architect of the British Empire. He is one of the most underrated, unknown people in history. And without a doubt, he deserves much more stature than he has been given by history. And there was a point in the story where his wife dies, and because his wife is dead, he throws all his efforts into getting Livingstone home, because Livingstone is really his only friend. He wants his friend back, and he just devotes the rest of his life to that moment. But to really tell the story accurately, I had to know when his wife died. But for some reason, if you look through the London papers at that time and everything, there was no obituary, there was no notice of her death or anything. And I kind of tried to bluff, and finally my editor said, you got to go back, you got to find the tombstone, and you got to know when she died. And so I did. I made this trip to London just to go to Brompton Cemetery and look at her tombstone. But again, what happens is I look at the tombstone, I realize it's made of a certain kind of marble that was found in another monument that's predominant in the book, and everything kind of starts going off on a new track. So it's fun, you know, and at some point I just had to stop, and I just had to say, it's done. Yes, sir.
At the time you were writing this, wasn't Lake Tanganyika and Victoria and even the source of the Nile pretty well documented? I had never heard that Livingstone was actually lost at that time.
What happened was, in 1857, Sir Richard Francis Burton and John Henning Speke went in to find the source. At first, they thought the source was Lake Tanganyika, and then then Speke went north, and he said the source was Lake Victoria. And they came back to London, and they were going to have a debate about what the source truly was. And the papers were calling it the Nile duel, because, you know, the Nile at the time was mankind's greatest unknown geographical mystery. It was a huge thing to find the source of the Nile. It was just major. And so 2,000 people packed into a conference room in Bath, and I'm trying to remember the date off the top of my head. Anyway, it was a cold, rainy day. 2,000 people cramped in there. They'd been waiting 3 hours in the rain just to get inside. They're wet, they're angry, they're hungry, and 11 o'clock comes and goes. Burton is there. Speke, it turns out, has killed himself. And so he can't present his side of the story. And so what the Royal Geographical Society says, they take Livingstone, who had just been totally shamed by his previous expedition, and who needed to make sure he had enough money for his retirement. And to do that, he needed to be able to find the source and write the definitive book about that search. The Royal Geographical Society went to Livingstone and said, you will be the one to find the source of the Nile. Go in, find him. And basically, they thought it'd be a piece of cake. They thought it would take him 2 years at the most. And then Livingstone basically said, you know, you need to make sure you pay me. This, you know, we're gonna. And he got the agreement, and off he went. And then he disappeared. Yeah. And actually, they didn't pinpoint the exact source of the Nile until the 1960s with satellite photography. In the 1930s, they found a north and a south, you know, lakes in the mountains of Burundi that were kind of going into Lake Victoria, but it wasn't until the 1960s that they actually pinpointed the source. No. Well, you got to read the book. You got to read this. It's about the book, all right? It's about the book. You're working this thing, okay? Okay. No, he wasn't lost. He was just overdue. So. Yes, ma'am.
How did you choose this topic to write on?
I wish it was more profound. I've got a beautiful wife, and I have 3 lovely sons, but I also have a great deal of wanderlust. And one of the things about my career is that I get to travel a bit. And the more you travel, the more you kind of narrow down the places you really want to go. And as an author, the books you get to write about next are the places you get to travel to, right? So I wanted to go see a lion in the wild. It was that simple. I had been to Africa before, but I'd never seen a lion. So I knew that I wanted to go back to Africa to see a lion. It really began with that. But then I had just written about Captain Cook, and I knew I wanted to write about explorers as well. So I needed to make that link between the nautical exploration of the 18th century and the more land-based exploration of the 19th century. And there's a link there. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but basically Sir Joseph Banks, who sailed with Cook, formed what later became the Royal Geographical Society. And so there's this huge, you know, continuum in exploration. And when I settled on this thing, so, you know, here's where the symbolism comes in. This is what I love. Livingstone, it turns out, and this came up in the research, was known as the Lion of Africa. So I had my lion. And I saw 2 in the wild. So that was cool. Yes, ma'am.
I guess I want to know what your next topic is.
I can say this now. We just made the deal a couple days ago. I'm proud to say this. It's about Christopher Columbus's final voyage, his 4th voyage, and it's not the usual Columbus book because his last voyage was this epic debacle. All of his ships sunk. There's gold. There's sword fights. There's warfare. There's a Shackleton type thing where one of his men goes off in an open boat to try to rescue them. There's treachery, and it's just a very humbling experience for Columbus. And I found, though, when I began to research it, that Columbus is not what we know. He never had his picture ever painted or drawn in his life. So any picture you've ever seen of Columbus is not what you think. He was 6.5 feet tall. He was freckle-faced. He was red-haired and fair-skinned. And when I read that, it just kind of flipped everything around. I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to write a new portrait of Columbus in a way that people have never seen him before. And what he did, he did many very unexcusable things, but he was also a very brave, bold man. And I want to balance those two in this portrait. And it's going to be tougher than this because the research is not so easy to find. So that's going to be fun. Yes, ma'am.
With all the adventures that you had in Africa, are you going to write a book about that part of it? Your own?
You know what I want to do?
Trick?
It's hard. The book world's tough. I mean, if nothing else, it's still a business. You got to write books that people want to buy, and I want to write about those travels, but I also feel like they're still a little bit too close. I want to put more distance between them to write about them well. Hemingway once said that you need to be able to, put that distance between you before you can write about something. And that's what I want to do. I want to write about that. And at some point, I want to write about all these adventures. I want to write about the trip around the world, which, by the way, is not as epic as it sounds. We were in the Concorde, and it was a Sports Illustrated assignment. We flew at Mach 2 at 60,000 feet, eating filet mignon and drinking champagne for 31 hours. But I got the record, all right? So it's, but it'd be fun. It'd be fun to write that stuff. But I just want to do it well. I don't want to do just a, kind of a half-assed job. I want to do it in a way that really brings it to life. Yes, ma'am.
When I heard you talking on the Mantle show today, I sort of thought about a book I read called The Heart of Darkness. Did you get that sort of a sense of the Africa that you were in parts of? And do you think, or did you find anything that that indicated that the exploration might have been for more than just to find the source of the Nile?
That's a good question, and actually it's true. Livingstone did have an ulterior motive, because his previous expedition up the Zambezi was to open a waterway into the heart of Africa so they could colonize Africa. And the idea was, it was a very Victorian point of view, that if you gave the African people the ability to farm, to grow cotton, the ability to have commerce come and go, and they would control the flow of commerce, and then eventually he will also want to have Christianity and colonialism as part of that group there, that bracket. He thought he could propel Africa into the next century, into modern times, and so when he failed on that expedition up the Zambezi, and part of the reason obviously is Victoria Falls. You can only go so far up the Zambezi. You can't go into the heart of Africa. He never really stopped searching for that path. But now it's interesting. Joseph Conrad based Heart of Darkness on Stanley and Livingstone, and yeah, he did. Yeah, Livingstone was this curtsying figure, and he really admired Livingstone a great deal. He loathed Stanley. Matter of fact, when Stanley was returning from this journey, Conrad was living in Marseille at the time as Stanley came through. And Conrad, my facts may be wrong on this, but I'm trying to think back my research. He tried to commit suicide shortly thereafter. There was something about that whole thing that really he despised, that brought him down. So, yeah, it's the Victorian era. There's 10 different things going on. There are layers upon layers and layers and stuff like that. Oh, no, we got subtext. No, I think I did my job. There are a lot of layers, and like I said, I was amazed that, here's a point I make in the book, and it's open to historical debate, but at the same time all this is going on in Africa, the exploration of Africa, the opening of Africa, the exact same thing was going on in America. We had, just as Livingstone's pushing into Africa, we had men pushing across America. The difference is we had one country that eventually settled all of America. So we kept kind of a cohesive sense of unity. Whereas Africa became fragmented. You had all these different nations, making it a little bit of piecemeal, this and that. And just my point of view, I think that's why Africa has never always been different, and that's why the tribal differences are still as strong now as they were when Livingstone was there. Yeah. Anybody else have any questions? Oh?
What is the attitude towards Stanley and Livingstone today in Africa, if anybody cares?
I'm sorry?
What is the attitude towards Stanley and Livingstone today in Africa, if anybody cares?
They're kind of bemused. Not too many tourists make the trek to places like Tabora to see the house Stanley rented for a while, or not too many tourists actually go to Ujiji to see the place where they met, but a number do. And those that do, the locals kind of look at them like, you came here, why? But they know why you're there. And I got off the train in Tabora, and the cab driver's out front, makes it sound like it's this big, yellow cab, or one of the big London cabs. It's a little Toyota with the doors off, and the seats were soaked with gasoline, and it just, and we're driving over these ruts that are this deep, and the car's bottoming out. But he took me out to Stanley's old house, but he knew immediately upon seeing me that that's where I wanted to go. He figured that was the only reason I could have come, and yeah, it's like anything else. It's a tourist industry. What?
I have Stanley's journal.
You have Stanley, the original?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Now, after I shocked you, I just wanted to shock you.
I was going to say.
Years ago when I was doing publicity at 20th Century Fox, you saw the movie Stanley and Livingstone.
The
Spencer Tracy
movie, yeah.
Well, throughout the picture, Spencer Tracy writes in a journal. And I was on a set one day, and I saw that journal. I said to the property man, "That's from Stanley and Livingstone." He said, "Sure." I said, "That really interests me." And he said, "If you want it, you can have it."
Oh, my gosh.
So I still have it. It's really weather-beaten, and it looks like something that Stanley would have written. And it has Spencer Tracy's handwriting in it, so.
Wow, that is something. I'm humbled. That's really cool.
You can't have it.
I can't have it. All right. I'll give you a book. Give you a free book. And an audio cassette, okay? When I was researching this, there was this, at the British Library, if you look up documents, they won't let you look at some of them if somebody has actually purchased that recently. They have a law that people can actually buy British documents, but they, before they're taken out of the country, they're put on microfilm. And then the person who purchases it, usually at Christie's or Sotheby's, can request that no one is allowed to use it for research for a period of up to 5 years. And there was this one document that Livingstone had written, a letter to Sir Richard Francis Burton after the Nile duel, explaining why he was an explorer. And I really wanted that document. And it turns out it was owned by a judge in Washington, D.C., Russell Train, who was the chairman emeritus of the World Wildlife Fund. And I just called him, and he transcribed it for me. And then very offhandedly he said, "Oh, by the way, I just bought Livingstone's gun at auction." It's like, man, that's got to be a lot of money. Yes, so, it's cool too. I'm kind of going on here, but last summer, just not even a year ago, in an attic in just outside London, some of Stanley's relatives found boxes full of Stanley's original artifacts that had been sitting there for 100 years. They found his compass. They found his copy of Burton's Lake Regions of Central Africa, dog-eared and written in the margins, so as he planned for this journey, and all that stuff. They found his gun. They found his pistol. Everything was just someone found it in the attic. So it's history, huh? Anyway, thank you all very much for coming out. I'm going to hang around and sign books, and if you do get a chance to read the book, I hope you enjoy it very much. Thanks again.
Martin Dugard is author of Farther Than Any Man and Knockdown. His latest, Into Africa, is published by Doubleday on the web at doubleday.com. Next week on Public Live's Gentleman Revolutionary, Richard Brookheim